Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and good morning to all of our friends west of here. My name is Rory Lancman. I am the Director of Corporate Initiatives and Senior Counsel at the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. And this is our webinar on key anti-Semitism issues in the post-10/7 workplace. We're joined by a distinguished group of panelists who are going to cover some important topics that hopefully will help you understand some of the issues that are occurring in workplaces across the country in light of the terrorist attack that occurred on October 7th in Israel and the aftermath. It's now my pleasure to introduce for a formal welcome and introduction the president of the Brandeis Center, Alyza Lewin. Alyza?
Hi, thank you very much, Rory. It's a pleasure to be here. As Rory mentioned, I am president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar, Key Anti-Semitism Issues in the Post-October 7th Workplace. The Brandeis Center is presenting this webinar in conjunction with the American Association for Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and Shine a Light. Shine a Light is a national initiative to spotlight modern-day anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism. The campaign takes place in December because it draws its inspiration from the story of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, and the message that one small light can dispel darkness and that together we can overcome hatred. The Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law is an independent, nonpartisan institution established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. The Brandeis Center conducts research, education, and legal advocacy to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism on university campuses and in the workplace. We ensure that students and employees understand their legal rights, and we educate administrators and employers in best practices to combat racism and anti-Semitism on campus and in the workplace. By shining a light on anti-Semitism through programs like this one, the Brandeis Center and the AAJLJ hope to educate our society to better recognize anti-Semitism so that we can be better equipped to address it. Our focus today is on anti-Semitism in the workplace post-October 7th. I'm pleased and honored to be joined today by our four distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is the Honorable Rory Lancman. Rory currently serves as the Director of Corporate Initiatives and Senior Counsel at the Brandeis Center, where he oversees our efforts to combat anti-Semitism in the workplace. This includes developing and publishing research and opinion pieces on workplace anti-Semitism, counseling employees on their rights under federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws to be free from anti-Semitism in their place of employment, and, where necessary, representing employees in legal proceedings to vindicate those rights. Prior to joining us at the Brandeis Center, Rory has served as a New York State Assembly member and New York City Council member from Queens, where he was raised and where he attended public schools. He's a graduate of Queens College and Columbia Law School and an Army veteran. As a practicing lawyer, Rory has represented dozens of employees in anti-discrimination cases before regulatory agencies and in state and federal courts. Our next panelist is Professor Shai Davidai. Professor Davidai is an assistant professor in the management division at Columbia Business School. His research examines how people judge themselves, other people, and society. He studies the psychological forces that shape, distort, and bias people's perceptions of the world. Professor Davidai's expertise includes the psychology of judgment and decision-making, economic equality and social mobility, social comparisons, and zero-sum thinking. His writings have been published in numerous top-tier journals. He received his PhD from Cornell, and prior to joining Columbia, he spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton. So he has seen and witnessed firsthand the growth of anti-Semitism on campuses. Also relevant to our discussion today is that Professor Davidai has become a bit of an internet sensation due to video clips of remarks that he has made, which have been circulated widely regarding comments he's made regarding the current anti-Semitism at Columbia University. Our third panelist is Jonathan Segal. Jonathan is a partner at Duane Morris, LLP, and the Employment, Labor, Benefits, and Immigration Practice Group. He's also the managing principal of the Duane Morris Institute. The Duane Morris Institute provides training for human resource professionals, in-house counsel benefits administrators, and managers at Duane Morris client sites, and also by way of webinars for an even broader audience. He's previously a litigator, but his practice now focuses almost entirely on helping employers meet their business objectives by minimizing legal risk. And our final panelist is Stephen Montoya, partner at Montoya, Lucero, and Pastor. As a civil rights attorney and Supreme Court practitioner, he has protected numerous clients from diverse forms of discrimination. He has won millions of dollars in verdicts and settlements for clients over the years, and he has established significant legal precedents through his appellate advocacy work. He has also been recognized by the NAACP for his, quote, outstanding leadership in civil rights. It's my pleasure now to turn the stage over now back to Rory to begin off our conversations today.
Alyza, thank you very much. And again, thank you to all the panelists for taking time out of your very busy professional and personal lives to share your experiences and your expertise with us. So at the Brandeis Center, we find ourselves almost inundated with correspondence and communications from employees across the country, most Jewish, but some not, some allies, who are facing a torrent of anti-Semitism in their workplace. And these workplaces vary significantly. They include colleges and universities, represented by Professor Davidai. They include teachers and staff in K through 12 schools, including here in New York City. In fact, recently my alma mater, my high school, Hillcrest High School in Queens, was the subject of a terrible anti-Semitic event against a teacher who had the audacity of participating in a pro-Israel rally or parade. But it also includes individuals who are employees of a diverse array of Fortune 500 companies with sophisticated and well-funded HR departments and diversity, equity, inclusion programs in the fields of tech, design, entertainment, reporting, you name it. And some of the recurring fact patterns, recurring instances that we are trying to deal with and guide employees through include corporate statements that are either non-existent or are unhelpful. Many employees, especially at larger companies, have seen their companies make statements in support of important social movements that have happened in this country in recent years to express corporate sentiment in support of or in recognition of certain significant traumatic events that have happened in this country and around the world. But many Jewish employees looked to their companies and heard only silence in the aftermath of October 7th, or worse than that, heard statements, saw statements that were at best equivocal and in some cases actually offensive. In top of that, sort of general anti-Semitic atmosphere that Jewish employees have felt, many have been borne the brunt of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel expressions from their coworkers in Slack channels or other internal communications systems that companies have. And that sort of direct harassment, that personalization of anti-Semitic conduct has been very difficult for them to bear. And employers have struggled, although in our view, needlessly, because the circumstances are clear, have I'll say, I won't say struggled, I'll say equivocated in defending their Jewish employees and hiding behind ideas that some of these anti-Semitic expressions are merely political ideas that are being expressed in the workplace. And when does conversation or an expression about Israel or Zionism or the war cross into anti-Semitic behavior, which points to a fundamental problem that we see across the employment sector, which is the failure of companies to adopt a meaningful definition of anti-Semitism, which will allow them to analyze and evaluate claims of anti-Semitism by their employees. And of course, our view at the Brandeis Center, which is consistent with much of the Jewish world, and in fact, the United States government, is that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, definition is what corporations and everyone should be using to evaluate and determine whether or not a certain expression or conduct is anti-Semitic. But corporations, by and large, have not adopted IRA, and we are seeing the fruits of that in their inability to meaningfully address anti-Semitism complaints that they're hearing from their employees. Couple that with the fact that most companies have DEI programs that fail to include anti-Semitism as part of their curriculum, part of their training, part of their mission statement. And you create an environment where employees across the spectrum find it difficult to channel and articulate their concerns about anti-Semitic conduct. And so many many employees have come to us not just to see what can be done and what their rights are and where is the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but also complaining that they simply do not have a vehicle, a collective vehicle, for bringing their concerns to their management. Very few corporations recognize Jewish employee resource groups or affinity groups alongside groups that have been established for other ethnicities. And we've helped, we are in the process of helping a few and hopefully going to have a successful result in the next couple of weeks with one major international corporation that will finally recognize a Jewish employee resource group. But many employees have come to us complaining and wanting to know how they can get anti-Semitism training and anti-Semitism education to be a part of their company's DEI program. So there are a tremendous number of challenges. It's not unique to any one institution, organization, or agency. But at this particular moment, we are seeing to a degree that we have never seen the issue of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel activities, support for BDS needing to be analyzed and considered in the context of federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. So with that overview, Alyza, I turn it back to you, and I know we're all eager to hear from Professor Davidai and our two private sector attorneys who are giving us their time this afternoon.
Yes, so I want to now turn it over to Professor Davidai. Shai, why don't you share with us your experience?
Thank you for thank you, and thank you for having me. I mean, I think it's you use the word distinguished. I don't see myself as distinguished in any way. I am just a professor. Prior to October 7th, I was very happy to be in my own office, in my own little bubble, and not know that all of this exists. Unfortunately, that bubble has burst. And I'll talk about, I'm a university professor. As a university professor, I'm in a weird position, right? Because universities are typically thought of as a place where we educate students, right? That's our main goal, research and teaching. But in that mix, people forget that I'm also an employee of the university. And as an employee, I am entitled to the same federal protections like any other employee. And I think that has been lost in the mix. I think that is something that the university presidents that we saw in the congressional hearings, for example, they have just completely disregarded. Universities are one of the biggest employees in the US if we take the number of people. So I think that's important. And I think there was mentioning of DEI. I think it's also important that in our fight against anti-Semitism, which I see as a civil rights issue, right? This is not a Jewish problem. This is not an Israeli problem. This is a civil rights problem. It's a problem of an ethnic group being targeted in the United States. It does not negate other problems, but it is a civil rights problem. And I think that as we start examining DEI processes in companies, in the federal level, we have to make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Our goal should be to improve DEI offices. Our goal should be to make sure that anti-Semitism is treated like any other type of racism. And especially in universities, our goal should be that every person, faculty, staff, student, goes through training, DEI training, that also involves what is anti-Semitism, what is anti-Zionism, why they are both types of racism. The two big things that I've been dealing with in the past couple of months, or I'd say I've been dealing with a lot of things, but the two big questions that I've realized, like crystallized in my mind about anti-Semitism in the US, are this. One, we are an ethnic minority. We are one of the smallest ethnic minorities in the US, right? Estimated at around 2.6%, but disproportionately targeted in hate crimes against Jews. But we're also unique in the sense that we are a quote unquote invisible ethnic minority, right? I am not religious. I am very Jewish, but I am not religious. So I have no religious symbols of my Judaism. This is actually why I started wearing my Star of David, to identify myself as like, I am not just, a general majority group. I'm actually part of the minority group, right? I think it is a problem, for example, when people join companies and they have to fill out different forms, and Jewish is not part of an ethnic option, right? You have white, you have non-white Hispanic, you have African Americans, you have all the groups, which is very important, but I've never found myself, I don't have the box, right? I don't check Jewish in religion because it's not my religious identity per se, it is my ethnic identity. So I think it's important that everyone, if you're an employer, that you realize, like, that you recognize that many people may be Jewish and you're just not aware of that, right? So I think that's an important thing that I hope in the next few years we'll see more visible signs that we are a minority, and it doesn't have to be religious signs. The other thing that I think is important, and I think it's happening a lot in the conversation now, in the national conversation, this line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Now, Zionism, if you look at the origins of Zionism, it's the idea that the Jewish people have a right for self-determination. It does not say where it should be. It does not say what kind of self-determination, but it's the idea that Jewish people have a right for self-determination because of the history of persecution, which goes back thousands of years. Employers who don't understand the importance of Israel for Jewish employees are, in a way, failing their employees, because when a Jewish American employee is concerned about the state of Israel, it is not the same like any other employee concerned about their homeland in Europe or in Asia or in Africa. Because for Jewish Americans, and for Jews, I guess, and all around the diaspora, the idea of the state of Israel is basically the idea of us being able to have a safe place to escape when they come for us. Unfortunately, we need that because of history. So when people say, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I am just anti-Zionist, what they're really saying is, I'm not anti-Semitic, I am just against all of the Jews' existence in this specific area in the world. And to me, that just sounds anti-Semitic, and a rose is a rose and by any other name. And I think one thing that we need to be aware of is the use of coded language. right? We are used in the world, especially in the United States, to experience anti-Semitism from the far right political spectrum. And historically, the anti-Semitism from the far right has been very blatant, using all the oldest anti-Semitic tropes, and also a bit unbashful about it. What we're experiencing now in the past few years, and an extreme uptick in the past couple of months, is anti-Semitism that comes from the far left. Now, that anti-Semitism is very much different in the way it's expressed. It's more intellectualized. It's as as unbashful, but it's more coded, right? So I have been called the worst things in the world in the past couple of months, but it's rare that they would say Jew, they would say Zionist, right? And I think that is an important thing. We need to be aware of the language that's being used. And the last thing I'll say about this is we also need to be aware of the media where that this is happening, right? So a lot of the anti-Semitism that's happening now is happening not necessarily face to face, not in person, but we're seeing it happening on mediated channels, right? So on Slack channels, if you're in employers, for Slack channels, for anonymous channels that occur in a lot of employers, in online social media, things that are maybe harder to monitor, but they are still extremely disruptive to Jewish employees. They are extremely scary for Jewish employers. And the problem is that the perpetrators and the victims are very aware of what's happening, but the company, the employers, typically have a hard time finding. So I think we should be very aware of that. One of the and I recommend that everyone kind of read more about what anti-Semitism looks like these days. One of the books that have been very formative for me, that I read a few years ago and I've been rereading now, is Deborah Lipstadt, Anti-Semitism Here and Now. She's the envoy to the White House on anti-Semitism. And I think, and it uses different categories to figure out kind of anti-Semitism, not necessarily on a scale from bad to worse, but just for people to understand how anti-Semitism looks in different ways in society, especially in the US society. I think I'm Israeli, so I can ramble on for hours, but I'll keep my mouth shut. But if there are any questions, I also would love to answer questions specific about universities or general about the Jewish-Israeli experience, which I am also aware is a bit different from the Jewish-American experience.
So I think we will, Shai, want to hear about how the anti-Semitism on campus is, as you started out by saying, impacting not just the students, but we do have to remember that for a whole slew of faculty and even staff or administrators, the campus is their workplace. And I do agree when you talk about one of the problems, not only in the campus environment, but also in the workplace, is that so many people, administrators, employers, silo Jews. Their understanding is that Jews are a religion, and they believe that the only type of discrimination that Jews could be experiencing would have to do with their religious practice. So even employers would understand that maybe they may have to give some kind of Sabbath accommodations, or students on campus will be seeking Yom Kippur accommodations, or they may need kosher food, or there may be certain if there are religious men who want to wear a beard, right? These kinds of accommodations in the workplace deal with religious practice. And one of the challenges that we have today, as you articulated, is trying to make sure that society recognizes that Jews are more than a religion, that we are a people. The way the Brandeis Center articulates this is to explain that what does that peoplehood mean, right? That peoplehood means that we all have this shared ancestry, this shared collective memory, right, of the Jewish people's history. We are those who were descended, right, from the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we are the ones descended from the people that were once slaves in Egypt and were liberated and wandered 40 years in the desert, or as we just celebrated the Hanukkah holiday, right? That's our ancestral heritage. That's our ancestral history for all of us, regardless of what our level today of religious practice may be. But one of the points you talked about, how Zionism is essentially the recognizing the right of Jewish self-determination. That is correct. At the same time, the Jews do have a very unique and distinct connection to the land of Israel. And when you start to talk about the history and the ancestry of the Jewish people, it is actually impossible to separate that from the land of Israel. So the natural place, right, for Jews to be saying we have a right to self-determination is to say we have a right to self-determination in some borders in our ancestral homeland. And what's happening today is whether you feel that that right stems from our history, our ancestry, our connection to that land, or because of our concern that as the Jewish people, we need a safe and secure place to ensure the safe continuity of the Jewish people, that concern all comes from a place of identifying as part of the Jewish people with our history and our heritage. And so when folks are turning around and labeling anybody who believes that the Jews have that right to self-determination or Zionists, right, and that they're not entitled to that homeland, right, that self-determination in their ancestral homeland, that now has become the label, right, to say that part of your history, that part of your ancestry, that part of your sense of Jewish peoplehood, that's unacceptable to us, right? We're going to treat you as a pariah unless you disavow or shed that part of your identity. And that's how we get to, you're exactly right, treating this as a civil rights issue and recognizing that this is a form of discrimination, harassment and discrimination against Jews on the basis of what defines them as Jewish, what defines their Jewishness. So now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Segal, who can talk to us a little bit more about in the workplace, how we address these issues.
Wonderful segue into what I want to talk about. And I want to first thank you and the Brandeis Center for including me and for providing this opportunity on an important issue. We all know that anti-Semitism is increasing, at least everyone on this call. And as Shai said, not only from the right, but from the left. And just because something is dressed up in social justice garb doesn't make it any less dangerous, often coded, often dressed. But we see it from the left, right, and I suppose in between too. When, by one bit of background, I did litigation, as you mentioned. I deal with compliance. I think of myself as a management side civil rights lawyer. What do I need to do to help companies prevent and then remedy discrimination or harassment? And historically, my focus was gender. The last few years, it's been anti-Semitism. And what I want to do is focus on what do employers need to do, and more specifically, where are there some gaps? I want to acknowledge that I think there's a real gap for employers generally when it comes to preventing and responding to anti-Semitism. It's not only on college campuses, although that's obviously an example of employment as well, but there's a gap, and that gap may not be anti-Semitism. I want to be always careful with the label. There's a general gap when it comes to preventive or compliance measures with regard to religion writ large, not just anti-Semitism. And from a strategic matter, I've often found it helpful to talk about when you see the gap on anti-Semitism, that's showing you a larger gap. And we see an increase in claims by other religious minorities or even majorities. And this is an opportunity to fill that gap. What does that mean? I first want to just hit real quickly the silence issue. I think an employer could and perhaps should adopt a position of neutrality with social justice issues. But you can't speak out vocally on every social justice issue that there is, regardless of the differing views on it. And then when it gets to anti-Semitism, say, well, wait a minute, I'm concerned there are other views, as if there were no other views on the social justice issues. The silence is problematic in those cases, as problematic as the universalization to condemn all. We're going now to all lives matters. I've seen the condemnations that don't mention Jews, don't mention Israel, don't mention anti-Semitism. We abhor and denounce bias and hate. no matter who it's against, no matter who's engaging in it. And conspicuously absent is who's the object of it. I don't think you need to necessarily say who's engaging in it, but you have to at least say who's the object of it. And when I've been able with some organizations to compare their statements before and their statements now, they can often see it. One client said, well, what could I do on this issue? I know my employees probably are divided, as may be business partners. Well, show me what you did on the Ukraine. Show me what you did on George Floyd. Show me what you did in some of these other areas. We'll just use that as a starting point and modify as need be. And sometimes that modification process took some time. But I think the condemnation is important as a comparative matter. If an organization says, I want to be silent on social justice issues, I think that's okay. I think the problem is the comparative nature. Rory mentioned the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I would encourage everyone to review it. That to me is a wonderful starting point. And I think for every organization, you can't prevent or remedy anti-Semitism unless you know what you're looking at. And I think the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance, I'm not going to get it wrong, Association or Alliance, said it's is really an important starting point, not a stopping point. And I think it has credibility when you look at all the nations, all the institutions, et cetera, US states that have adopted it to be apolitical or bipartisan. Both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have said support, have echoed support for it. Not a bad point to mention, although in today's political climate, maybe not to use political names, but just mention that there is bipartisan support. For employers, some are saying DEI should do the training on anti-Semitism. And in the administration's guidance on anti-Semitism, that's one of the recommendations. I'm okay if DEI includes it, but I don't think that's where it can end. I do have a concern if you have a function that hasn't even addressed anti-Semitism or acknowledged it to provide the training on it. And I do have a concern also that some of the oppressor-oppressee concerns that are said in some DI, not all DI circles, may affect and infect the discussion of anti-Semitism. What I want to suggest to you is what employers, what are you doing to stop racism? What are you doing to stop sexism? You have clear policies, and you have at a minimum clear policies and mandated training on discrimination harassment so that your managers don't engage in it. And when they see it, they can stop it, report it, and then employers can remedy it. We have to put, I respectfully suggest, anti-Semitism in that same training modules. When we talk about what is racism, what is sexism, we should be including anti-Semitism. We should be giving specific examples of harassment. And when we talk about it, I'm just going to give you the categories. There's discrimination, segregation, which would be really matching people based on their religion, harassment, failure to accommodate, and retaliation. And these are all independent of, but overlap with DEI. So when you get to discrimination, I want to build on a point that you, Alyza, specifically emphasized, and I heard others mention. Judaism is an ethno-religion. One doesn't have to go to synagogue to feel strongly Jewish. And because Judaism is an ethno-religion, and by the way, Islam arguably is an ethno-religion as well, the discrimination against someone's Jewish could be because of their religion, because of their ethnicity or national origin. One judge said because of race, even arguably genetic information, depending on how the concerns are phrased. It's important to know how anti-Semitism may be protected under the law, because that's a framework for knowing what you do to prevent it and what you cover in your prevention. And I just wanted to go over what, in my experience of working with employers, are 6 categories of anti-Semitic conduct that may take the form of discrimination if it results in adverse employment action, not hiring someone, not promoting someone, firing someone, or may take the form of harassment, words, etc., images in or affecting the workplace. Number one, I'm going to cover those that we already talked about, and these are really things that may relate to the narrow definition of anti-Semitism, which is discrimination because of someone's exercise of Jewish tradition. So one could be because of look requirements, someone who is Orthodox and modestly dressed, someone who's Orthodox and is wearing a kippah, and discrimination against that. They don't look like what we want our employees to look like. There's a lot of precedent that talks about look requirements, the legal risk in them. That's maybe the most obvious and one that needs to be called out. Accommodation avoidance. I am concerned about my obligation to accommodate someone, therefore I don't want to hire them. And when I say I don't mean I mean giving the thought process of a person. What you'll note about both of these examples is they could apply to someone Jewish, they could apply to someone Hindu, they could apply to someone Christian who would have the Sabbath on Sunday as opposed to Saturday, or Saturday as opposed to Sunday. Again, tying in this broader issue of look requirements in religion, emphasis anti-Semitism, accommodation avoidance, and then as a footnote, I'll come back to this, and then that could be for any faith, but it could be in particular in our topic, anti-Semitism. Number three, I want to hit hard, only in saying it, that we have to deal with pure, unadulterated hate. Because the people that are marching in the streets kill the Jews. Many of them have one thing in common. They're employees of organizations, and they don't leave their hate at the workplace door. And their hate can be manifest in decisions that they make, discrimination, or comments that they share, harassment. So we need to make really clear that we know there's hate out there. And just as racism, those who harbor racist views don't check them at the workplace door, the same thing would be true with anti-Semitism. So number three, dealing with unalloyed animus, and it's no less hateful when scantily clad in social justice garb. Number four would be stereotypes and tropes, not promoting or hiring Jewish individuals. Again, this is on the adverse decision because of tropes about Jews. And one of them, and there are sadly so many, in the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, have done a lot of good material on that. Maybe I could pop that in the chat after the conference if I can figure out how to do that. But some really, sad how pervasive some of these tropes are. But in one of them I do want to spend a moment on is the conspiracy theory that animates much of the anti-Semitism. It's a conspiracy theory that we saw back to the protocols of the elders of the Zion. We saw it in Nazi Germany. As Jews, we are less than, but we also are in control of the media, the government, etc. And we do things to benefit ourselves and to harm others. And that kind of trope about Jews also has some of the animus. I know that Shai, is it Shai or Shai? I'm not sure I pronounce it correctly.
Shai.
Shai. I know that I've seen you, I follow you on Twitter. Anyone who's been on Twitter knows that it's important to stay engaged so that we can share other views. But sometimes I'm on Twitter and I need to take a shower when I'm done because the hatred that's coming out of there is really painful. And well, you don't need more protection under the law. You control the law, you control this, you control that. And I don't want to be more sarcastic than I am inherently, in particular, a topic that's serious. But when people talk about Jews controlling the world or controlling things on university campuses, does one really believe if Jews were in control, we would have what we have on these campuses? I mean, it kind of speaks for itself that we're not. I want to deal with number 5, and this is the one that's the most sensitive, and I'm going to deal with it head on. It's the theory that Jews are oppressors and are overrepresented, and therefore we need to take care of that. And sadly, some, not all, DEI initiatives reinforce that notion. Some, not all, DEI initiatives look at things in a binary between oppressors and oppressed. And if you are underrepresented, it's because of oppression in the system. And if you are overrepresented, it follows, then you are benefiting from systemic bias. And that comes out in some DEI initiatives, again, not all, that needs to be dealt with quite directly head on. It is anti-Semitic assumptions underlying some DEI training and some DEI activity. But that needs to be dealt with in a compliance program on discrimination and harassment, that you can't make decisions about an individual Jew or Jewish person because of your perception that they may be overrepresented, or associational bias because you view Israelis as oppressors. And therefore, this kind of binary notion that Jews are oppressors and therefore can be discriminated against because of that. And that leads me into, and by the way, the Harvard-Harris poll that came out last week said, do you think that Jews are oppressors as a class? 73% said no, 27% said yes. Well, that's somewhat of a relief to me, except when I look at the following. If you're 55 and older, you're going to average around 88% saying no. When I look at people 18 to 24, 67% say Jews are an oppressor group. So I can't, in the remaining moment, suggest I could come up with an answer, but I don't think we can ignore that trope, which is false and dangerous. And then finally, as everyone has said, I think we need to hit head on that anti-Semitism includes anti-Zionism. The name changes, the same virulent ingredients apply. I was someone who a couple of years ago said I thought someone could be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. I have good company, at least with Michael Oren, when I've heard him speak on this topic. I need some cover because I don't know how I came to that conclusion before. But if you only attack, I want to give one example again from the employment perspective. Let's just assume someone doesn't think there should be a Jewish nation state. Okay, I want to go through and I have a list of other nation states that revolve around a religion or ethnicity. As long as you're speaking up against them, and no one is, then you're not anti-Semitic. One can be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic. But if you only speak up about Israel and you ignore Syria, you ignore what's going on in China, you ignore what's happening in North Korea, then by definition, that is anti-Semitic. It's treating same or similar, and I'm not going to engage in false equivalency, very differently. So I think what's important when we train managers is to say, this is nothing new. This is the heart and soul of what you've always known in compliance. You just need to call it out now as to Jewish people.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to make sure that we have time for Stephen, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and then I will try to, in the final few minutes that we have after his presentation, address some of the questions that have been popping up. So thank you, Stephen. I think you may
Hear me
be
now?
on. Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say this is probably the most important thing that I'll say. I'm really happy to be here because I agree with Shai. This is a civil rights issue. I am not Jewish, I'm Catholic. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico. The reason why I stand with the Jewish people now is because they've been a victim of grave injustice. And after October 7th, I just don't see how any decent person can deny that. And I feel a great urgency regarding this issue. Having devoted 35 years of my legal practice to civil rights, I also agree with Shai. This is a civil rights issue. It's a classic one. So let's talk about the law, because sometimes I engage in training, not too much. Over the years, I have learned that it's more effective to engage in litigation. I sue people, sue companies for discrimination. And I want to talk about the laws that forbid this type of discrimination that we've been talking about this morning. The first law is one of my favorite laws. That is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. As the year of its enactment suggests, it's related to the Civil War. And it was passed immediately after the emancipation of slaves by the 13th Amendment ratified on December 6th of 1865 in order to allow the recently emancipated African Americans to contract on an equal basis with everyone else. And initially it was primarily used to protect African Americans from discrimination. However, in 1987, the Supreme Court of the United States issued an opinion that looked at the legislative history of the 39th Congress that enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and concluded that really the act protects all ethnicities in any other type of discrimination that's based upon ancestry. And that clearly protects Jewish people. And that there's a Supreme Court case right on point, as a matter of fact. It's an interesting case because even though the Civil Rights Act of 1866 protects people from discrimination in contract, the case in point in 1987 by the Supreme Court involved an attack, the desecration, to use the court's term, of a synagogue. That's why it's an important law, because it really prohibits discrimination in anything that could impact a contract.
Stephen, I just need to interrupt for a moment. Somebody mentioned that they're having a little difficulty hearing you, so maybe if you could speak maybe closer to your mic.
Okay.
That's
that
better.
help?
That does help. Great. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is a very broad law. It applies to private parties. You don't have to have a contract with them. If anyone is interfering with your contract, they're liable. For example, in the infamous case of Columbia University, if you have students that are interfering with a professor's ability to teach and do his job, those student organizations can actually be sued, because the Civil Rights Act of 1866, as amended by the Civil Rights Act of 1991, does cover private entities, it does cover groups, it does cover individuals, and it prohibits discrimination based on ancestry, based upon race, based upon religion, if the religion is coextensive with ethnicity or ancestry, as Judaism usually is. So the Civil Rights of 1866 is a very potent law. It provides for compensatory damages and also for punitive damages and also for injunctive relief. Another very potent law in the workplace, of course, is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That applies to employment, public employment, and private employment, and it protects people based upon race, national origin, which brings up the issue of Zionism. What is anti-Zionism? That is a form of discrimination based upon national origin. Oftentimes, I think that I read that Shai is from Israel. It certainly would prohibit discrimination against Israelis or people who are descendants of Israelis. And it prohibits discrimination in employment. It provides for injunctive relief. It provides for compensatory damages for pain and suffering. It also provides for punitive damages to dissuade people from engaging in similar conduct in the future. It's a very potent law. It also provides for attorney's fees to the prevailing party, and like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 does. The last law that I'll mention is also from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That is Title VI. And a lot of people are using that because it does cover anti-Semitic discrimination. That's my least favorite statute because a few years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that you cannot recover compensatory or punitive damages under Title VI. All you're entitled to, it's a very big threat, though, to most entities that receive government funding. So Title VI only applies to entities that receive federal funding, like Columbia University. I'm sure the medical school receives tons of government funding. I'm sure Columbia University receives tens of millions of dollars from federal agencies every year. So that is a very potent tool. And this is not a new area of law. As Shai also pointed out, this is standard, traditional, well-established anti-discrimination law. And the federal courts, in my opinion, will be very, very intolerant of anti-Semitism and related discriminatory conduct in the workplace. And I'll end with this. In reference to anti-Semitism in the workplace, I think more often than not, to use a phrase that Jonathan used, adverse employment action. A lot of times anti-Semitism doesn't involve a traditional adverse employment action. We're not going to hire you because you're a Jew. We're not going to promote you because you're a Jew. We're going to fire you because you're a Jew. Instead, it involves what is commonly known as a hostile work environment. For example, in the sexual harassment context, hey, you're really hot. Hey, you're really sexy. That can create a hostile work environment. But the concept of a hostile work environment also applies to anti-Semitism. If you have a work environment where you're being harassed because you're from Israel, you're being harassed because you're of Israeli ancestry, you're being harassed because you're of Jewish ancestry, even though you are not a practicing Jew in reference to your religion. Section 1986 or Section 1981, also known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that recognizes a cause of action for a hostile work environment. So does Title VII. So does Title VI. All of these statutes provide for attorney's fees to the prevailing party. All of these statutes are well known in the federal courts. All of these statutes, as Jonathan knows, are well known, and as Rory knows, to litigators. So these are available avenues that are already well established, well paved, that you can use to fight anti-Semitism in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to comment on just a few pieces that both Stephen mentioned and Jonathan mentioned, and that tie in with some of the questions that we have had. So one point that I just wanted to emphasize, Stephen, that you just mentioned when you talked about how the actual laws protect Jews from discrimination when they're being targeted on the basis of things other than their specific religious practice, but on the basis of their ethnicity, their national origin. The Brandeis Center brought a case, and this is in the Title VI context, an administrative case with the Department of Education. But what happened is it was a case that overwhelmingly involved anti-Zionist harassment and discrimination, and the Department of Education treated it as a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. So this notion that national origin discrimination is not limited just to an Israeli like Shai because you're saying, oh, they're Israeli, we can't discriminate against Israelis, but the idea that you cannot, national origin also encompasses a group that would view itself as a people, I suppose, with a shared heritage, a shared history, a shared ancestry, a shared ethnicity, and you could discriminate. That type of discrimination against them on the basis of that part of their identity could be considered national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. Going back now to something that Jonathan said when he was talking about remaining neutral and employers remaining neutral, or campuses, administrators remaining neutral, and this impacts clearly folks like Shai who are working on the campuses. One of the big problems I think that we find is that university administrators probably because they have sometimes waded into these social justice issues or waded into giving political statements where they probably would have been better off not picking a side. They now think that when it comes to the Jewish issue, they mistakenly think that what's being asked of them is to pick a side in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And nobody wants them to do that. Nobody wants them to weigh in. Nobody actually really cares what their position is on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They're not in a position to give or to choose, and they don't want to. What we want them to recognize, though, and the statement that is so important, is for them to recognize the shunning and the marginalization that's taking place on their campus or in their workplace of the Jews in that space, right? Because what we're seeing happening on campus is that folks are, and this is the way anti-Semitism always works, folks are demonizing the Jew, right? Whether it is, as numerous speakers, right, I've talked about the traditional anti-Semitic tropes, that the Jew is controlling, that the Jew is doing all of this for the Jew's benefit and to harm the rest of society. Right? That's the way anti-Semitism works. The Jew is the scapegoat. We don't like the way something is going in society. Guess who's to blame? It's those Jews. So the implication is the world would be better off without the Jews. So let's push the Jew out of acceptable society. Let's make the Jew the pariah. And that's what's happening on campuses today when the Zionists, right, where the Zionists aren't welcome. And the same thing even in workspaces, particularly on campus, but beyond, where the idea is you're that kind of person, right, who supports Israel, you're the Zionist, you know, we don't even want to sit next to you, much less engage with you. And so the statement that's needed and the recognition by both the employer and the administrator is to say, we cannot tolerate that in our workplace, on our campus. We will not tolerate pitting part of our community against a segment of our community. That's the statement we need. And then there have been numerous questions about DEI. And I think, Jonathan, that what you really got to in your comments is that we support the idea, right? All these laws that Stephen outlined, that you talked about, that are designed and aimed to protect against discrimination, right? That's a goal that we all share. That's that piece, right? If you're talking about DEI programs as wanting to ensure that we are addressing discrimination, that we're addressing bias, the problem often comes in with the equity piece, right? Somebody asked, what is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? The equity piece is the piece that tends to divide the world, as you talked about, into two categories, the oppressed and the oppressors. And then again, if you're following this idea that, well, the Jews are to blame, so all the Jews get thrown into this oppressor category. What that really does is that erases Jewish identity, that prevents us from celebrating openly our Jewish heritage, our Jewish history. And what we need to demand is that Jews have every right to fully engage in society today with our full identity that includes our pride in our shared ancestral ethnic heritage, which is deeply rooted and connected to the land of Israel. And we have a right to demand the respect that we be given and that we be allowed, right, to fully participate in society today. And nobody has a right to demand that we give up or shed or hide that part of who we are. And so when somebody was saying, we don't want to be victims, absolutely not. We don't want to be victims. We are saying we're proud of who we are, and we will not, right? We will not permit you to demand that to engage, we have to give up any part of who we are. I want to thank all of our speakers today. I know that there were people who had some more specific questions that they put into the chat. We are here to help you. Please reach out. You can always send and reach out to us at info@brandeiscenter.com and give us the specifics of your situation, and we would be happy to work with you and to try and help you address those. So I thank you, Rory. I thank you, Shai and Jonathan and Stephen, for all your invaluable comments. And
thank you very much, Alyza. If I can just say one thing, you know, I've been specifically, you know, beyond the work issue, anti-Semitism, I've also been specifically focused on anti-Semitism on campuses and specifically on the organizations that support Hamas on campuses. So if you want to keep up to date with the things that I've been doing on social media, on Twitter and on LinkedIn, I'm not used to being in the public spotlight. I do not enjoy being in the public spotlight. but I think the message and the goal is more important than anything else here. So you can also follow and contact me through online, and I'm happy to help with whatever way I can.
Absolutely. Terrific. Thank you, because that really is one of our key front lines right now is on the campus. And so thank you and bless you for all that you're doing and the support that you're providing to students and to other faculty and staff. Thank you. Thank you all. So with that, we'll conclude today's webinar.